Hello and welcome everyone to this week's webinar, Access All Learners. As the title suggests, and hopefully most, if not all of you are aware, today this webinar really focuses in on digital accessibility. I do premise that with digital accessibility, a lot of this, of course, does apply beyond the digital sphere, but that will probably be the main thrust of my points. However, with a bit of kind of thinking, contextualization, you can, of course, apply it to any context that you're working in. We are going to sort of be pretty focused initially on the sort of compliance side of things in terms of web content accessibility guidelines from W3 or WCAG. Not just from a this is all there is perspective, but because it's the framework most of us will be familiar with. If you're sat there thinking I'm not familiar with it, don't worry. This is a good opportunity to get started with it. But we are then going to look at things beyond those guidelines, the things where perhaps we lack standardization, where we lack detailed understanding, and I can't necessarily provide full understanding. What I can do, though, is kind of shine a light on those areas and say, hey, we need to really be thinking about this stuff. There will also be a quiz. That's right. Don't worry, it's nothing too terrible, but there is an opportunity to test your existing knowledge on some success criteria from the web content accessibility guidelines. A really good opportunity to see if you know your stuff or if these are areas you need to work on. And of course, when you're emailed out the recording of this, you will get what we call our WCAG translation guide, which we created for our clients, so that when they're looking at the W3 website, they don't have to go through all of that. They can really just narrow down to what's relevant to them as learning and development professionals. So without further ado, let's get cracking. Do, by the way, jump into the chat. Let me know where you're joining from and where you're at in terms of your, I think the cliche term is accessibility journey, by which, of course, we just mean, how are you feeling about accessibility? Are you just getting started? Is this your thing? Are you the internal expert in your organization when it comes to accessibility? What areas are you struggling with, and what areas are you really making great progress in? Share where you're at in the chat. And in the meantime, I will get started by upsetting at least 50% of the audience. One of the biggest problems in the conversation about accessibility and inclusion is it leans very, very heavily often on lived experience. Now, lived experience is tremendously, tremendously valuable. However, it is often not generalizable. And what I mean by that is that just because that is your absolute, genuine lived experience, that is real. It happened, it has value. It does not mean it is a good basis for making broader decisions that impact other people. And that is very difficult to hear as a human being. I say this as someone who, uses certain assistive technologies, and have in the past said things like, well, I'm dyslexic, so I understand the following things. And it took other people kind of really pulling me aside and saying, that's not helpful. And actually, what you're saying is not generally helpful. Yes, this is how you deal with being dyslexic, but as someone else in the same shoes as you, or seemingly in the same shoes as you, I can tell you that is not only not helpful, that will make my life more difficult. So this makes this conversation very difficult sometimes. Lived experience has tremendous value, but we must not use it as the basis of generalized guidelines and rules. This, to my mind, is the genius of W3 and the web content accessibility guidelines. It's the reason they are so useful to us. It's because they aren't based on, well, what I think is, or my personal view is that. They are based on rigorous testing, experimentation, and iteration. They pull together a vast audience of people who have input into creating those standards. Their strength is their generalizability. And they acknowledge, if you read their early drafts, that there are therefore things that are not in the guidelines that they would like to be able to address, but have not been able to standardize in a way that lets them write a useful guideline. And as we'll see as we go in, we will get a feel for the guidelines are inherently broad. They have to be in order to be applicable in most circumstances. So this will kind of underpin a lot of the conversation today, a lot of the points that I make, and my general thinking around accessibility. It is not and is never about saying that lived experience doesn't carry value. It is about saying that we have to acknowledge our own experiences or the experiences of the one person telling us about what happened to them are valuable, but are a single data point, and that we cannot shape our entire approach around single data points. We have to take a more generalized view with that as input, but still more generalized. So with that in mind, just have a quick look at the chat. Where are people at? Just getting started on accessibility. Want to know about microways to embed accessible digital methods. Nice. I'm preparing to create my first accessibility course. Okay, brilliant. That's an exciting place to be. Dublin here. Accessibility expert for your role. Brilliant. Great to have you with us, Ian. Banbury, Oxfordshire, haven't stayed up to date as I would like. That's fine. I think that's where certainly I come to this topic not as an accessibility expert. I come to this conversation as an L&D practitioner. When we work with clients, what we do is we spend time enabling L&D functions to upskill in whatever area is relevant to them. And accessibility, we're consistently having conversations where people are like, we need to upskill in accessibility. Accessibility is really important to us. It's like, right, so what is it? And the room kind of goes quiet. Well, it's accessibility. It's good. We should do it. And I get it, but it doesn't sound like a great business case, does it? Often, I think accessibility gets pushed down the list. We all know this happens. But I think often we go, oh, well, it's because no one cares. People don't think. I disagree slightly. There are cases where that is what's happening. But I also think we have done a tremendously bad job of making the business case for accessibility. We have made accessibility a conversation about inclusion and being nice and being good and being moral and all these things. And I agree with all that messaging. But that's not what businesses do. I say that as a business owner. Businesses do not exist to do good. Businesses exist to make money. And so we need to start thinking about how we frame the accessibility conversation to the business. It should not be because it's the right thing to do, even though it should. It should not be because it will make people feel more included. That makes all of us feel warm and fuzzy inside, but doesn't mean a lot to the business until you make the link that making specifically training content accessible makes training more effective, not just for those who need the accessibility support, but for everyone. There's 101 studies backing this up. We make things more accessible, the effectiveness of training increases. If the effectiveness of training increases, productivity, sales, compliance, whatever key measure your business cares about goes up as well. That is money. That is what the business ultimately exists to generate: stakeholder value, financial income. That tie-in is vital. So often when we do questions at the end, one of the questions is, how do I get my business to get on board with making things more accessible? That's the way. We could do a 20-minute chat about, the morality of inclusion and all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, it comes down to, look, this can make all of our training more effective universally. More effective training, you should all hopefully be on board with, will increase the following KPIs, assuming you're an effective L&D function. That will lead to greater value generation. That should be our business case for accessibility, in my view. And the clients I've worked with on that topic have succeeded when taking that approach, where perhaps they have struggled beforehand trying to argue that it's the right thing to do side of things. That will sometimes go against the grain of those of us who care very deeply about digital inclusion, but it is the reality of getting stuff done. And sometimes we have to set aside our personal preference about how we would do things for the for the efficacy of actually getting things across the line. So I mentioned we were going to take a look at the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. These are a phenomenal set of guidelines, not, I should note, aimed at L&D. They are aimed broadly at the digital world, probably more specifically, I guess, at websites. Or at least that's where they started. I will drop in the chat now a link to the W3 site. The W3 site is an absolute goldmine of accessibility guidelines and standards. You can see there how they get to these guidelines, the process they go through. It's actually a very public process. They publish their early drafts. I think the early drafts of version 3 either are available soon or are already available. I can't quite remember off the top of my head. But it was the same with 2.2. We had views of the drafts like 6, 7, 8 months ahead of launch, which is really interesting. And requesting open feedback, requesting people's input and ideas. As I mentioned, a lot of the people involved in W3 are volunteers. They give their time to improve the standards of these the guidelines. Now, over time, these have kind of become pretty globally accepted. They're not truly globally accepted. They're still challenged by certain groups, but broadly, and especially in the L&D space, they are the most cohesive set of guidelines that we have available to us. Certainly the most applicable guidelines anyway. The problem, if I may be so bold, with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines is that there are a lot of them and they are not written for normal people to understand. This would be my singular significant critique. And so I thought we'd start by breaking them down and making sure that everyone here, when you look at that site, can really understand what you're looking at. And the first thing to be aware of is that there is a framework that these sit in, often referred to as the PAW framework. This is really just the 4 areas into which all the guidelines fall: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Now, these are, to their credit, exactly what they sound like. They are the questions that you would ask of a piece of content, of a digital experience, in terms of it being accessible. So we might ask, for instance, is this video captioned? I.e., can someone perceive the information? So if I can't watch the video or hear the video, rather, are there captions? If I can't see the video, is there an audio alternative with audio descriptions? Is there a transcript available? Simple things that allow people to literally take in the information you are providing. Operable. Can I tab through the course using a keyboard? Can I make it work? Relatively simple again. Understandable. Do I know what this button is going to do before I click it? Do I understand why this image is located here next to this piece of text? Am I able to sort of take in the information and use it as opposed to just perceiving it? And is this robust? Does it break when someone uses it on a different device? Will it break in 6 months' time? If anyone remembers the death of Flash and the collective heart attack we had as an industry where everyone had to reauthor their content because they'd ignored the 3-year warning they got about the death of Flash, thinking, well, I'll deal with that later. Robustness probably failed that one there. That was obviously quite time specific, but it will happen again. There will be something else that is removed. Don't know what it'll be, but it'll happen eventually. But probably more day-to-day, thinking about devices, thinking about platforms, thinking about formats that might not work for certain audiences in certain contexts. Robust is probably the trickiest one to talk about out of context, because a lot of it is dictated by the technology and not wholly by your decision-making process, though, of course, you're deciding what technologies to use. So a big part of your purchasing as an L&D function should be around that consideration. Are we buying a robust technology that will allow us in the long term to deliver accessible experiences? I think that is often overlooked. We often think that accessibility is something to consider at the design stages when we're creating things. We actually need to be considering these things long before we do a needs analysis or need to create any kind of intervention. When we're building our tech stack, when we're building our ways of working, when we're thinking about how we engage with vendors, these should be the questions we're thinking about very, very early on. Because if we're buying into technology or content or ways of working that prevent us from delivering accessible experiences, doesn't matter how knowledgeable we are, doesn't matter how hard we work to try and retrofit it later. We see this in a lot of rapid authoring tools, unfortunately, still, where they're now themselves retrofitting accessibility to their authoring experiences. Yes, for the end user, but actually a lot of them still don't offer an accessible authoring experience. If, like me, you use a lot of voice typing or you use a screen reader, you'll be familiar with how terrible it is to use some of these online authoring tools, and even some of the desktop ones, actually, to the point where I have to turn my screen reader off when I'm authoring e-learning content. Not only will it not help me, it will come out with some weird stuff that I'm just like, this is actually now harming my ability to do my job. So these are very common issues, and if we have them, our users have them. It's always worth bearing in mind that, especially when we're talking about standards and guidelines and success criteria, like we're about to dive into, we can get a bit lost in the idea of compliance and meeting standards. But at the end of all of this are human beings trying to do their job. And our role here is to make that easier for them, ultimately. We are here to make them as good as they can be at their job and make doing their job as easy as possible. We can't do that if we are not delivering accessible experiences. If these experiences are not perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, we are ultimately failing at our main duty in the workplace. So why is WCAG so complex? Well, basically because it's got a lot of detail to it. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines do their best to not just tell you, hey, everything should have captions, because that's not helpful. That's fortune cookie wisdom. We should train for performance because it's better. Nice bit of circular logic, but doesn't really help. And so they provide not just top-level advice, but the framework, the PAW framework we just looked at. They also then provide the actual guideline itself. They provide examples. They provide success criteria. So when you read through, although there's a lot going on, and we'll kind of, as I say, go through this as in the next couple of stages, we'll look at each stage of a guideline and how it breaks down. It's complex because this is a complicated issue. It's complex because a guideline has to be contextualized to what you're doing. You can't go to them and expect, in Storyline 360 version 2.8.3, you will need to do that. They can't offer that. So what they do instead is offer, as I sort of mentioned at the start, a generalizable set of guidelines and success criteria. Not just that you need captions, but that captions are essential in these contexts, and good captions should meet the following standards, because not all captions are the same. So, the anatomy of a WCAG success criterion. This is kind of the most exciting stuff I can imagine, but this is important to understand. We can't use the guidelines without understanding the anatomy of a criterion. So we start off, as I mentioned, with a description. These are given at the principle, guideline, and success criterion level. They basically outline the intent. We're going to be talking about captions because captions are important for video and blah, 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 all that sort of stuff. Each guideline, though, has another description, which will be provide alt text alternatives for any non-text content so that it will be changed into other forms that people need, such as large print, braille, speech, symbols, or simpler language. You see how it's like next level of detail. Then we have success criterion. All non-text content that is presented to the user has a text alternative that serves the equivalent purpose except for the situations listed below. These descriptions don't tell you what to do, but they outline the intent. The reason outlining the intent is so important is that generalization principle. That idea that they cannot write a guideline for every conceivable context, every conceivable situation. But if you understand the intent of the guideline, then you can contextualize it. You can consider, how do I best deliver on this idea in this situation? It would be lovely, of course, if the guidelines did just tell us exactly what buttons to click, exactly what to do, but we're never going to have that. It's never going to be that easy. So these do require work from you to make them work for your users. So the criterion also have levels. You may be familiar with the idea of something being A, AA, or AAA. You'll be familiar with this in certain sports. You're familiar with it from the gaming world. Well, the accessibility world has it as well. But it's not quite the same. There is a common misconception that like A is the minimum, AA is the middle, and AAA is the best. It's kind of true, but not really. They are not sequential in that way. Some standards only have an A standard. Some only have AA and AAA and all sorts of other things. The way I think about these is that A is a foundational standard. If you are not delivering consistently A level across all criterion, there is a significant problem that requires immediate attention, because you will be excluding some people. It's not absolutely true there. You might be incredibly lucky and defeat all the statistics and not have anyone with an accessibility requirement in your organization, but it is unlikely. Even in a small organization like mine, we are full of it. So next level, AA. This is broadly considered to be accessible. So you'll often see, oh, our standard is to meet the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.2, which is the current version, AA across all criteria. This is considered to be acceptable across the board. It's also, for many areas, the level you need to go to. It will help the vast majority of people successfully use your content. It would be very tempting, especially if you have a mandate to create, really accessible experiences, to try and then deliver on all the AAA standards. But a lot of them are highly specialized. And because they are specialized, they can be both time consuming and expensive to implement. A lot of them actually require separated versions of experiences, because they will require something that will be distracting or detrimental to those who do not need it. It's essential then that you really consider what standards are necessary in your organization. It is not as simple as do everything. So I tend to talk about it in phases of development. I always tell our clients, start with A. Make sure you are consistently delivering A across the board, regardless if your long-term objective is to be the world's most accessible training provider. Start at the foundation level. Because if that foundation is not established and strong and known and working, there is no point in pursuing some AAA standard that's incredibly specific and niche and helps one person in your business when half the business can't utilize your content. So focus and start on delivering all of the AA standards. Then go out to your organization. You're going to want to work on all of the AA standards, but you're going to want to prioritize, because there are a lot of them. And you should prioritize based on real need. Go out to your people and ask them what is going to help, what is currently getting in the way, what is preventing them from getting maximum value out of the content you're providing them. You don't only do those things, but you prioritize those things. This also goes back to the business case I mentioned previously. Being accessible can, if you're not careful and don't do it properly, be very expensive and time consuming. But if you do it in a phased sequence if you consider what's going to add value immediately, i.e. help people get better at their jobs, do that first. You front end the value for the organization, selling them on this idea that accessibility does have real world benefits. It does drive performance. It does drive revenue. And then once you've delivered all of your AA, only then should you be thinking, okay, so of the AAA standards, what needs exist within our organization? Do we need to be offering British Sign Language? Does anyone in our organization use British Sign Language? Now, that's not to say you should never do anything accessible that isn't required today, but that's a good example of something that can be quite expensive, quite time consuming. A lot of the tech stacks that are around will make that a difficult job for you. It will require significant rework. It's worth doing if even one person needs it or would benefit from it. But if no one does, then it's probably not worth prioritizing right now, unless you've got a mandate to do it specifically. Maybe you would be better off prioritizing something else on the list. It's not about saying this is unimportant, but it is about being realistic when it comes to workplace resources and sort of deployment timelines. So the other thing that all of the criteria have are exceptions, because these were written by people who work in the real world. The idea behind the exceptions is that there are always some. A good example is that there are cases such as capture testing and decorative functions where you may not want to apply a content accessibility guideline standard. There may be situations where it is not feasible to do that given where technology is today, and the guidelines acknowledge that and outline them for you. Notably, this is the one area where they do call out very specific situations. So it is worth, when you're going through the guidelines that are relevant to you, to pay attention to the exceptions, because they are set. There aren't exceptions that exist that they haven't mentioned. So for instance, if your LMS uses capture testing, which I don't think any of them do, but who knows, they're always evolving, and they might introduce something like that. You are pretty much stuffed when it comes to accessibility. They're just bad. That's why very few workplace technologies use that kind of access testing. But if it does get introduced in your organization, you're then able to say, hey, these are actually an exception to all these standards because they can't be applied. Now, that should be a concern about bringing that into your tech stack, but also tells you, look, don't waste your time. There's nothing you can do about this. So looking at a guideline, you'll notice this is the you'll notice this is the actual guideline straight from W3. The first guideline, which is text alternatives. We would often refer to this as the alt text standard or the alt text guideline. That's not strictly accurate, but it's often what it's called. You can see here how these things are laid out. You've got numbers, you've got titles, and you've got links. So let's take a little look. The first thing to note at the top, we've got our framework title, perceivable, and the number 1. Perceivable is always 1. That way you know where in the framework this guideline sits. Then you have the guideline title, text alternatives, 1.1. The first number is for the framework, the second number is for the guideline. Then you have the success criterion, 1.1.1, non-text content. Again, framework, guideline, and now the criterion. If this guideline had 6 criterion, that last number, that third number, would go up with each criterion. So this would be 1.1.1, next would be 1.1.2. You get quite long strings of numbers, as you can imagine with this, but they are really useful. Specifically, they are useful when it comes to testing and testing with others. Being able to quickly communicate, oh, we've got an issue with criteria 1.1.1. We need to do the following things. That is often a lot easier than doing the, oh, yes, we've got a problem with the non-text alternative content on whatever it might be. it gives you options more than anything else. You don't have to communicate it in that way. I find it tremendously useful to use the coding, but that's probably because I'd rather see numbers on the page than I would words. If you're the inverse of that, use words. But you can see here, you've got the descriptions as we discussed of each one. You've also got very helpful little link boxes next to each of them, providing additional information and supporting guides. W3 have been really good at this for a long time now, in terms of trying to support people. You'll also see a lot of links within the standard to other things that are related to this criterion. Sometimes there can be slightly too much of this from a kind of overload perspective, but they are there to try and help you. Basically, if it's relevant, they will put it in here. And you can also see they then outline under the success criterion that if you deliver what is outlined below, you'll be reaching level A. This is a good example, text alternatives, of there is only a level A. So you deliver it, you deliver all of it, and you get an A. That's it. And you don't need to do any more because it's fairly flat. It's fairly standard. So this is a simple guideline, but it's a good one to get your head around how these things are structured and what the expectation is. Throughout all of this, there's a really simple way of thinking about anything you might want to implement in your organization. Specifically, I talk about these 4 questions. What's the barrier? Who's affected? What's the fix? And how do I do that in my tool? And I use these 4 questions because they match up to the 4 questions that W3 think about when they're writing these guidelines. Each guideline outlines what the barrier is, who might be affected, what the fix is, and how it should be implemented. Now, they can't tell you specifically how to implement it in your tool, just on a general level. Again, there's some work for you to do here, because our job is to look at these guidelines and say, okay, so in my context, what's the barrier? In my context, in my workplace, who in the business is affected by this? Do you have a working understanding of what accessibility requirements exist in your user base? If not, how can you be designing for them? What's the fix? How can you reasonably, effectively, efficiently help them? Now, there's a lot of everything should be 100% accessible and anything else is terrible and we should all cry under our desks and blah, blah, blah and feel bad. But real world for a minute. We can't make everything perfect all the time. And I'll quite happily say, no one solution is going to be right for everyone. The idea that you build one thing that is accessible to every single person who could ever conceivably go through the experience is totally insane. There's just too much variety among human beings and among accessibility requirements, many that we still don't fully understand, to think that one single design could meet those requirements. And so we should be asking ourselves, what is the fix? Not how do I make this thing work for them? Just what is the fix? Is the fix an alternative? If I'm looking at videos and highly sort of detailed scenario-based content, is the fix something simpler, more streamlined for this group of people who are really going to struggle to interact with this? Is that the best thing I can do for them? Whether or not it makes me happy, because the important thing, once again, is that we do our job in helping them be better at their job and make their job easier for them in the long run and generate value for the organization. It may not be the textbook perfect solution, but if it fixes the accessibility problem for that user, then it is, contextually speaking, the right solution. And then finally, how do I do that in my tool? The guidelines help. There's a lot of online advice. Increasingly, tools are to their credit, building in more things to help. If there are any Evolve users around, that's Evolve by Interlum, not this Evolve, you'll know that they mark all their interaction types now as whether or not they are accessible. Obviously, you could make the argument there shouldn't be inaccessible types, blah, blah, blah. However, there are, so real world, they are working through, making them accessible and clearly marking which ones they've already done that with. You look at the big player like Storyline has recently introduced an accessibility checker, some big gaps, doesn't look at color contrast, has some issues with certain types of processing, but that's a big jump from nothing. So you can see in the tool space, there is improvement being made, not enough, it's taken too long, all those things, but real world, it is happening. Our job then is to plug that gap in between where the tools are at, where the standards are at, and where our users' needs are at. We need to find the balance of what we can reasonably deliver with the tech stack that we've got, or in the extreme case, by changing our tech stack. Sometimes our job is to say the tools that we have do not allow us to do this, and therefore we need to change whatever it might be. There are also, as you know, a whole host of free tools, some by organizations like WebAIM, some by W3. Increasingly, organizations are building their own. We have our own in-house sort of color palette checker designed for e-learning creation that generates like button designs and things like that based on color palette to ensure contrast. I'll share that in the chat towards the end. If you want to have a look at it, it's totally free. But those are the 4 questions we can always be asking ourselves about accessibility challenges in our organization. The last thing then that make the content accessibility guidelines a little bit tricky can be the language. Now, we surveyed a whole bunch of people that we've worked with to find out what was the language they really, really struggled with. The first phrase that came up was programmatically determined. This basically means that assistive technologies can understand the structure, i.e. H1, H2, H3. Why they don't just say uses a standard HTML structure, we shall never know, but they are technically correct from a developer's perspective. That is programmatically determined content. Then we have user interface component, which is any interactive element. In our world, think buttons, toggles, dials, sliders, anything the user needs to click or interact with on the screen. Then we have probably the one that has confused the most people that we've worked with, which is the term change of context. So change of context is anything that unexpectedly opens a new page, refreshes the screen, or moves the focus being the thing that is currently in focus on the screen or selected on the screen. So this is that classic example of clicking a button and suddenly a browser pops up. With no expectation, what is happening? The user is losing control of the situation. Visually, this is annoying. If you're a keyboard navigating user, it's a nightmare because sometimes the software will move your focus, your keyboard, over to the new window, and sometimes it won't. And so you'll know that something's popped up because you'll get you're usually using a screen reader and it will give you a little notification of that, but you won't be there. You'll have no idea what it is and if you should go there and how to get there. So change of context is one of those ones where I wish it used simpler language purely because it confuses and it kind of undermines a lot of accessibility efforts out there. But those are the 3 that come up consistently with very simple explanations, but it saves you looking them up basically. So I mentioned before phases. And we always get the same question, kind of what do those phases really look like? Here's what those phases tend to look like in our implementation plan. The phase 1, I said just level A, but there's actually a couple of double A's in there that we consider to be critical. So basically non-text content, info and relationships, which is that programmatic layout we were talking about, use of color, contrast, keyboard navigation, focus orders, and error identification. You'll notice there is nothing in there about time-based media. That's deliberate. The use of videos and audio is a choice. You do not have to use them from a design perspective, They are super effective and I love to use them, all those things, but they are not absolutely essential in all contexts. This is essential in all contexts. There is no world in which you are creating training where there is not written and clickable stuff. This is effectively what this is designed to deal with. If you're delivering all of this in phase one, you have a solid foundation. Phase two, things get a little bit more exciting, if you will. Resizable text, images of text, nightmare in of themselves. Just don't do them. But if you do end up having to have images of text, if anyone's come across that before, there's a whole guideline about them. Text reflow, non-text contrast, content on hover or focus, so all your state changes, things like that. Error suggestion, error prevention, all your time-based media stuff all goes into here. Then finally, in phase three, we look at our optional stuff, the enhancements, the things that you should do if they are relevant to your user base or the content you're creating. Specifically here, sign language, enhanced contrast, reading level, help, redundant entry, and accessible authentication. Things like accessible authentication are incredibly unlikely to be in your hands, but they are something to consider around the robustness of the platforms you use. Think your LMS, your LXP, mentoring platforms, things like that. Obviously, we cannot go into all of the guidelines here today, but I did promise you a quiz. So I say this is a game. This is a quiz. This is a quiz called Do You Know Your? Missed the your there. And we start with a round called Do You Know Your Captions? Captions are probably one of the most common conversations in the accessibility world, and also one of the most common areas of frustration, because most captions are really, really bad. If you want an example of really, really bad captions, look at the bottom of the screen and turn on the live captioning Google Meet provides. It's all there, but my goodness, is it ever all there? This is like an example of exactly how you should never caption your content. It is, however, officially better than nothing. So, just in the chat, I would love to see your answers. Now, you may know the answer. You may feel deeply uncomfortable about sharing an answer when you have absolutely no idea. Look at it this way. I'm going to share the answers for all of them anyway, so we're all going to learn as a group. But just throw out what you think the answer might be, even if you're unsure. Have a think. You might be surprised at how close just a little bit of thinking about the user, thinking about what's realistic, will get you to some of these answers. So the first thing we say is that within the web content accessibility guidelines, how accurate must captions be? So we've got 90, 95%, 99%, 99, 95%. As accurate as possible, but at least 90% displayed while being spoken. Good. 70%. Cool. Thank you all for sharing answers. I really appreciate it. There's nothing worse than running a session and just the chat going silent when you ask for input. The official answer from W3 is they should be 99% accurate in terms of the content and should be in sync plus or minus 2 seconds. Now, the reason for the sync allowance, and to an extent for the accuracy allowance, is that sometimes you might want to actually deviate slightly in the captions. The classic example being ums, ahs, awkward pauses. How do you punctuate pauses? There's a lot of difficulty in making this 100% accurate. There is also the challenge of live captioning, where, you know, realistically, especially if something's being accurately live captioned, the 2-second sync allowance is what makes that possible. So with that in mind, oh, the BBC captioning is, yeah, not great. Sorry, it came up in the chat then. I've never been entirely sure how the BBC's got away with its captioning standards for as long as it has. Interestingly, the web content accessibility guidelines very specifically are about the web. The broadcasting standards are wildly different. Scarily, I think the BBC does actually deliver on the broadcasting standards, but they're not great, shall we say. So how long should a caption frame be on screen? So this is per little box with words in at the bottom. How long should that ideally be on screen? We've got 30 seconds. 2 seconds per line. Good stuff. 1 to 6 seconds. As long as needed to be in sync. Excellent. Yes, so the guideline is 3 to 7 seconds. Now, this guideline has a whole bunch of stuff around it, basically saying the important thing is accuracy and whether or not it's in sync. The other big considerations here is that a 3-second minimum keeps us clear of the danger zone of having something flashing on the screen. For certain photosensitive conditions, something constantly seeming to flash at the bottom is risky. So 3 seconds moves us completely out of that danger zone, or at least largely out of that danger zone. You can never be complete. 7 seconds means your captions shouldn't be too long. This, I would argue, is probably one of the most flexible, though, in these requirements, because realistically, some words are big, some sentences run on. Sometimes the structure just requires us to play slightly loosely with this guideline, but that is the guideline provided to us. Where should your captions be? Yeah, so lower third, non-obstructive. So basically where you always think captions should be. Lower third, center of the screen, assuming they are not obstructing anything. It's up to us as the creators of the video to ensure we design our content to not be obstructive when someone turns on captions. Worth considering then, if you're going to have sliding in lower thirds, introducing speakers, are they going to get in the way of captions being useful, or are captions going to block over them? Design with those kinds of things in mind. Know where your users are going to be watching your videos, publish a test video, watch it in the player they're going to be using, and see what happens when you turn on captions. Nothing beats getting hands-on with it. How many lines should captions be maximum? Absolutely. No more than 2 lines. I'm a personal fan of single line captions, but two is the max. And according to the guidelines, how many characters should we aim for each caption to be? Got 42, max 40, 32 to 42, 80. So the W3 guideline is 32 to 45. Now, again, I think this is probably one of the most flexible things there, specifically because, again, some words are long. If you ever try to do captions in German, you know this quickly gets unrealistic, shall we say. There's a lot of challenge around this, and I would suggest that it's worth knowing that the basic principle is don't make captions really long. That's the important thing. My advice to people is always, look, aim for this, but if you go over, just ask yourself, is this reasonable to put on screen? Does this blow out everything else? Think about 3 to 7 seconds on screen. Think about single line, double line, all that sort of stuff. So let's do one more round of this, and then I want to talk about some non-WCAG requirements or things to consider. Do you know your alt text? So how do you go about creating alternative text for a decorative image? And just for clarity, when we say decorative image, we mean an image that's been added to a piece of work just to look nice. Could be brand related, could be just because you fancy a picture of a raccoon with a lollipop sat in the corner of the screen. Serves no purpose in terms of the learning experience, which does bring into question why it's there at all, but we do it all the time in our space. What have we got? You don't, you exclude it, no alt text, leave blank, or excellent. So you leave it empty. Decorative images should not receive alt text. Alt text is not image captioning. You might choose to add an image caption, but that should not be serving the same purpose as your alternative text. From a technical perspective, you would give this the tag alt equals and then empty speech brackets, or speech marks, I should say. Usually in rapid authoring tools, you've just got a box for alternative text that you would just leave blank. Some tools even now have sort of checkboxes to say this is a decorative image, and so don't even ask me for alt text, especially important if you are running like an alt text checker on it. But yeah, super important. If it's just decorative, don't waste your users' time and energy hearing about an image they don't need to know about. So why shouldn't alt text start with the phrase an image of? Excellent. Yes, it would be redundant. Screen readers, which is what is going to be read out by alt text, is going to announce this. It's going to say image or picture, or depending on which one you use. This is where I plug. If you've never used a screen reader, use a screen reader. It will drive you nuts for the first 20 minutes, and then you will never go back to, no, you will go back to using a PC as you did before. But it is worth the experience. It doesn't have to cost you anything. NVDA is one of the biggest screen readers around and has a free version. It's what I use. It works really well. It's hyper effective. And again, you can use it for testing all your content moving forwards. You and everyone on your team should have the experience of using a screen reader and accessing your content, your LMS, your whatever environments you're sending people in the digital space. You might be surprised how some people are experiencing the world of work and the world of workplace learning. Worth an hour of your time any day. So, functional images. Images that take you places. Here I am talking about, I'm turning this image into a button, let's say, or for whatever reason, I'm making all my buttons out of images, which seems to be quite popular. Apply an action, just over explaining the object image. Yep, absolutely. So ultimately, you describe the action. The action is the important thing here. What is going to happen when I click this thing? My screen reader is going to in some way tell me that this is clickable, but what is going to happen? We talked about that change of context stuff earlier. This is where that comes into play. Complex images. So what if I were to put a graph on the screen? How would I go about writing alt text for a graph or complex image? I would say the chat's gone silent, but it's usually a longer answer, so I'll give it a moment while people... Brilliant. Provide a short text summary and then a longer description elsewhere. That's exactly it. That is perfect. You are never going to be able to explain a full graph just in alt text, or you could, but it would be silly. Give people the heads up. What is the key thing here? And then give them access to a full description if they need it. Last one for this game then. How many characters ideally should alt text be before you consider going to a long description? And this number is purely a guideline, I should note. Outstanding stuff. So the guideline is under 125 when possible. The idea is to keep alt text functionally short so people can get through it. And then if more information is required, as with the complex images we mentioned, you're going to a longer description. Now, due to time and my inability to keep to it, we're going to skip past the next round, which was keyboard navigation. I've already kind of done my pitch for go and use a screen reader. This is basically that. How thick should indicators be? At least 2 pixels. What contrast ratio should be applied to the indicator when someone's navigating around the screen? 3.1. And where should skip links be? They should be the first focusable element. Going to skip audio description entirely because we didn't get around to that. I do want to draw your attention to alt text's unloved friend, ARIA. ARIA tags are the alt text equivalent for functional items or accessible rich internet applications. Basically, they are the things that tell us interaction-specific advice when we're a screen reader. Lots of tools like Storyline's a good example, do not give you access to this, it does it for you. Other tools do give you access, like Evolve by Interlum. Don't ignore ARIA tags. Check out the guidelines on the W3 site about applying them. That's a whole session in of itself, but I often see a lot of time put into alt text and none put into ARIA. Good design requires both. Image description and function description brought together to create a seamless, frictionless experience. So don't ignore it. It can really help you create a better experience. Now, I want to touch on a couple of specific things that sit, strictly speaking, outside of some of the current guidelines, but that regularly come up for people in this conversation. The first one is dyslexia. I said this is the one that has shaped so much of what I do. I'm dyslexic, my brother is, my dad is, all this kind of thing, and yet we're all very, very different. I luckily was not diagnosed when I was young, and so basically had a horrible experience of being forced to read because I was just lazy. Sounds terrible, but I'm incredibly grateful for that, because just a few years later, my brother was diagnosed and then basically got written off by the education system as well. It's not our fault we can't read. He actually had a much harder time of it because the diagnosis was there, but not the support. That is still the case for many, many people. Many people, though, will argue the opposite way, and that's why lived experience is not good for setting these standards. However, some good general advice. Fonts play a big role for helping people with dyslexia. Ideally, I would say use open dyslexic fonts for everything, except that's terrible advice for everyone who's not dyslexic. Your brand department will also implode if you try. So consider using sans serif fonts, things like Arial. They can be a good middle ground. Short line length and left aligned text. For the love of everything, please stop center aligning text without good purpose. It's very, very difficult to read. One of the principles, the way I read, for instance, is with anchoring. So the shape is more important than what the word actually is in terms of me being able to stay where I am. So when you center align it, you take away from me the established shapes that I'm looking for in terms of the paragraph and the flow. So left align text wherever possible and chunk content into small sections. That's just good learning design anyway, but it's really important from a dyslexic perspective. ADHD, getting increasing conversations about this right now. The honest answer is that we don't have great information on how best to support this group of people. And that's really worrying because it's not a small group. There's a lot of discussion, a lot of debate. There's some good research going on. Very little in terms of established guidelines right now. What we do know helps, or what we currently believe helps, reduce distractions wherever possible. That means no unnecessary animations and pop-ups and things, links out to other places can be really high risk. Using consistent layouts. So we establish how things work and we stick to it. Breaking content again into small, manageable steps with visible progress. How close are you to being done? When does the next topic begin? These things are much more impactful for this audience. Again, lots more research needed, but we're getting there. Autism, this is probably the area that is worst served today, in my view, by workplace learning. There is a diabolical lack of understanding and research in this space. And it almost to the point of being quite worrying. Now, we can take some generalized advice and apply it to our work, but we are in desperate need of greater understanding here. Avoiding sarcasm and figurative language. We should be doing that most of the time, but when you think about some humorous, funny, engaging, game related things we might sometimes create, this might be an argument for an alternative. Predictable structure and simple interactions, not being too clever with our sort of, hey, click and drag and twist and do this and do that. Why? Does it add value? If not, get rid of it. It's just getting in the way. And using clear, literal instruction text. I have been guilty in the past of kind of doing the, why are we putting instruction text on screens? The answer is that actually for some people it's really necessary. And does it really hurt my experience? No, not at all. So providing clear instructions on how to navigate and engage with content, super, super important. We do have a section here on executive function. using plain English, highlighting key actions, and provide reminders and visible instructions throughout. Actually very, very similar. But those are 4 areas where we are in need of greater understanding. We don't have good guidelines. And there are people doing good work. Nicola in the comments, really glad to see you there. I really would say she's a wonderful person to follow on LinkedIn. Thank you for coming today as well for this sort of stuff. There is good work being done, just nowhere near enough of it. We need more people to be involved, more people to drive that conversation, and more money ultimately put behind the research. But that's only going to come when we demand it from vendors and from providers. So that's everything I've got to go through today. The biggest thing I hope I leave you with is a better understanding of how the WCAG standards are formed, how you can use them, and maybe send you there now. Go and take a look. If you're only going to do one thing after this, go to the WCAG website, have a look at the standards, and start auditing. What you will get in an email, probably on Monday at this point, is this recording. You'll also get our guide to translating the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines into plain English, specifically for L&D professionals, as well as guides around captioning, ARIA tags, and alt text. In there, you'll also find an Excel spreadsheet. Good for you, a spreadsheet. But what that spreadsheet is a check sheet. The audit that we conduct on content to check whether it meets our minimum accessibility standards. It's a starting point, not the finished article, for you to audit your own content and decide where your next accessibility priorities lie. We are actually a minute over time, but I've got no plans because I have no life outside of the world of L&D. So if anyone does have any questions, please do either drop them in the chat or jump on the mic. We're happy to have a chat. But if not, thank you so much for attending and have a wonderful rest of your day wherever you are. Oh, great question. How do you strike the balance between design and accessibility? I love that question. So it's really tricky, actually. I'm supposed to say, oh, it's real easy. You just good design is accessible design, blah, blah, blah. But it does require thought. It really does. Because a lot of the things that visually attract us can sometimes be really inaccessible. A great example is color contrast and text. I love soft edge text. It's not very easy to read though, so I can't use it very often. I have to use it on personal projects rather than work projects. The thing I tend to think is that our design should be constrained by context, is my firm belief. So rather than designing and then saying, hey, is this accessible? Start with understanding what accessible is. What standards do you have to meet? And then you change the design question. The design question is, hey, not what we want to do. It's, hey, how can I best serve this user? You design for the context you're designing for. At the end of the day, we are not creating entertainment material. We are not creating artwork. We are not creating really, truly, even like graphic design stuff. We are working to a very specific brief. The other thing in terms of holding yourself to that is peer review. Don't design fully, design prototypes and test them. My golden rule is if I spend more than an hour on something, someone else should be telling me whether it's good or not. So if I've put an hour into some design related work, the look and feel of a new course, whatever, at that hour, I should be getting someone to peer review it and tell me what's wrong. Part of that should be accessibility. There's nothing worse than spending weeks on a masterpiece in inverted commas and then finding out that fundamentally you've got to change all the colors and the layout doesn't work and all this kind of thing. The actual, the act of design is, in terms of visual design, is kind of how I've automatically gone down this road, but you could apply it to any kind of design, really is all about constraint as opposed to freedom, in my mind. And so this should be the same as how do you design with your brand? Well, you follow the brand guidelines. As part of that, we should have our accessibility guidelines. As part of that, we should have our learning design guidelines. Having these things understood and documented will help you design within them. If they're all a bit in the air, it can become very difficult to deliver on all these sort of seemingly non-aligned requirements, where in actual fact, we know that a good brand will be accessible and be good at communicating information. Good learning design is accessible and good at communicating information. And the whole point of accessibility rather, is to make communication work in terms of passing on information and being clear. So actually, they all want the same thing. They just go about stating it in different ways. But that's kind of the best advice I can give, really, is working with those constraints from day one rather than applying them later. That's always what's worked for me. I'm relatively new to designing with accessibility in mind, but I find there's some overlap between designing for accessibility and translation into other. I find there's some overlap. Yes, absolutely. So, like moving content into other languages is a really interesting experience from an accessibility perspective, because there are so many things to consider. It's not just, as we know, language. It's cultural shifts, it's norms, it's sometimes you go, oh, we're localizing to another place. You'll change the language, you'll change the alt text, you'll change the ARIA tags, you'll change the button instructions, all this other stuff, and you go, well, also we're going to change these images, which seems mad until you realize that culturally, images that are totally fine here are not fine somewhere else, or that the message they convey is fundamentally different. A really great example is in the first version of this, we were using a slightly outdated image around autism, around the kind of puzzle piece idea, because we don't spend a lot of time with the autistic community. And so we were told, oh, actually, that's not a preferred image anymore. There's some stuff attached to that we'd rather move away from. We now use the handprint and things like that. Okay, brilliant. We can change the image. Being willing to adapt and change those kinds of things is really, really important, which is why that kind of rapid creation and testing and feedback and peer review is vital to all of this stuff, whether it's localization or accessibility. Your users should absolutely be your guides, not in terms of upfront lived experience, but in terms of live feedback to what you're creating. That's why, I won't ask people, did you enjoy a course? I will ask people, did you find the course accessible? Were you able to navigate the course? Were you able to understand the course? Did the course work on your device? I don't actually care whether they enjoyed it. I do care whether or not it was accessible and whether or not it was effective. So this is another opportunity actually to get into kind of course assessment, but that's probably a different session.